Please be comfortable. So, today, we've been together, priest and people. Started here as an assistant for over 2 years now. Can you believe that has kicked over? It's pretty astonishing, isn't it? And I hope that after 2 years with me, you'll know me well enough now to know that when I preach, I fly very close to the text. And when I prepare my sermons for you, I try to let the text speak for itself. When I trained, our bishop told us to keep our eyes always on Jesus. That's the point of preaching, to introduce us all to Jesus. And with the Bible in front of us, that's our focus, and always with a newspaper tucked under one arm. That's the Auslan sign for good morning, actually, for morning. You tuck a newspaper under your arm. And that's the way we bring our text or bring the wisdom that we get from Scripture into our world. So today, please bear with me if what I preach makes you a little uncomfortable, because you'll see why it's important as we go along. So this week, triathlete Xavier Kopok caused a stir across the news sites, because with the most gallant of intentions, he saw a picture on Twitter of a fellow athlete. And he suggested that this photo of Emma Pallant-Brown be cropped because it showed her menstruating through her triathlete suit. Now, Pallant-Brown graciously said, "Thank you for your care and your attention to me, but I'm completely fine with the photo." She goes on to say that healthy female bodies menstruate and that breakthrough bleeding in long events is going to happen. And it's bound from time to time in these long events to happen to other women too. And it shouldn't be hidden. Now, there's an obvious link to the gospel here today when we think of the hemorrhaging woman, right? And we'll get to it. But before we do, I was kicking this sermon around with my husband. I often talk to Garth about what I'm going to preach. And when I drew this particular link, he just looked at me and said, "Oh, you're not, are you? You're not going to go there." And it's a fair warning, isn't it? Because when I've talked in the past over time about my experiences or the experiences in the Scripture that are more strongly aligned with the experience of being a woman, I've been warned against having a feminist agenda. Those words have literally been said to me. I've been warned against having a feminist agenda. I've been told that speaking plainly about female physiology is too much information. And that came from a clergy person, not a person in the pews. And I just think, is it a feminist agenda to want the fullness of the biblical stories to speak into our modern day experiences? Is that an agenda? Is that my agenda? Or is it the gospel writer's agenda? And I hope that I am honouring the gospel writer today. Because let me pose this question to you. What is the agenda behind silencing parts of Scripture that make us cringe? What is the agenda when we silence parts of Scripture that make us cringe, that we consider impolite? How are we cropping the picture of our Scripture? Like Kopok, do we with all good intentions want to keep people comfortable and keep things polite and crop the full truth of the gospel to exclude bits? Like we would a photo that our young ones today might say makes it Insta-worthy. To avoid the very real human experiences that are described in our biblical texts because it might make us modern day readers cringe, seems to me to sell the Bible short. So with that in mind, let's consider the shape of the gospel text today. Jesus encounters Matthew sitting in his tax booth, collecting all the pretty, pretty money. Now that's not taboo in society, is it? Collecting the pretty money. But there's no doubt that tax collectors back then were amongst the least popular in Jewish society for good reason. They'd sided with the Romans and they were known for taking a cut above what was owed to them. Well, this was the dodgy sort that Jesus decided to say, "Follow me." And here, if you heard this tale for the first time, if you were a listener hearing this read to you, you'd be thinking, aha, the tax collector's going to be fixed, right? The physician's going to fix that dodgy sort. Here's a tale of redemption for Matthew. Transformation and change is coming for him. He's going to be disciple and he's going to become like the other disciples. And you'd be right to a point. But it's not quite as you might think. It's not that neat and tidy ending, because who comes to dinner then? More tax collectors, more sinners. They came to find Jesus. And this dodgy crowd gets bigger and even more dodgy. And then you have some self-righteous Pharisees on the side, weighing in for good measure. Now, I couldn't think of a good modern day analogy for you, but perhaps what it's a bit like is inviting someone you've just seen breaking into a car to come hang out with you. And then Jesus brings this person along and has a whole bunch of graffiti vandals and gang members rock up and share what they're having at the skate park for a dinner, with a local traffic cop on the side going, "Hey, what are you lot doing? Why are you encouraging this crowd?" And when challenged by the Pharisees, Jesus responds, "Learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifices. I came for the sinners, not the righteous." Edgy, right? Now we're hanging out with the bad boys. We're cool. And just as we think we've got a handle on the text, Matthew, the gospel writer, doesn't let us off the edge of our seats. He doesn't let us get comfortable, because in breaks now, into this motley crew, the synagogue leader. This is, to extend that modern day analogy, it's a bit like the bishop just pushed past that traffic officer and fronted up to Jesus amongst the motley crew. Because into this bunch of sinners and tax collectors, pushing past the judgmental Pharisees, is the epitome of what was considered righteous in that community. Someone held in the highest esteem by the religious establishment itself. And this person comes begging Jesus for mercy. Didn't we just hear that Jesus came for the sinners? Didn't we just hear that Jesus wasn't here for the righteous? The bad crowd gets the mercy, right? We're on the edge of our seats because a child lies dead, and a believing and desperate father begs Jesus for mercy. Who is it now that gets to see the physician? And then Jesus follows the religious leader. And Jesus follows the religious leader into his home to see his child. But yet again, but wait, there's more. Another character gets inserted into this story. It just keeps getting bigger. So we've got Jesus, who's following the religious leader to his home. We've got the disciples around him, and we're assuming there's probably other people along the way finding out what happened. And then there is a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. She sees them. And like the father who's leading the charge, this woman knew that this man would make her well. She knew. And she knew she just needed to slip in quietly, edge her way in and touch the edge of his cloak. No fuss, no fronting up. That was her duty, right? Invisibility. Know your place. Don't worry the teacher. I just need to touch the edge of his cloak. Not on Jesus' watch though, because what did Jesus do? He turned around and he looked at her and he saw her and he knew her suffering. He knows exactly what just happened. He sees her and heals her. And more than that, he calls her right into his family. He calls her daughter. Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well. She is invisible no more. But Matthew gives us no time to sit with that phenomenal story, because there is another daughter to reach. And so as we return to that determined father's mission, the one who's leading the charge, as we reach his home, we've got a barrier, a cacophony of a crush of musicians and a crowd making a commotion. And on the other side, a child lays dead. Now, at that time, it had become common across Middle Eastern cultures more broadly, not just Israel, to have professional musicians and wailing mourners create noise when someone died. Now, we hear the translation flutes, but that's not a very good translation, because it wouldn't have been those pretty silver flutes we hear in orchestras and marching bands. They were probably more like whistles and probably not tuned. There might have been some nasally precursors to clarinets and oboes. Some of the instruments that we have excavated since were made of bone. These were professional mourners, and it was a good gig for them. A rabbinic text talks about professional mourners and says this, that even the poorest amongst Israelites, his wife being dead, will afford her not less than 2 pipes and 1 woman to make lamentation. This is a serious, expert, money-earning death business going on here. And they laugh. Don't get in the road, you funny old rabbi. So they clear that crowd. Jesus had to send that noisy, windy, obstructive bunch out in order to restore the girl to her father, and in doing so brought her from death into life. At every step in these stories, people and their assumptions and their judgments and their priorities created a barrier between Jesus and the ones who needed his healing and mercy. The Pharisees judged the tax collectors and the sinners, and Jesus for associating with them. And Jesus welcomed them anyway. A crowd of Jesus' friends and followers stood between Jesus and the hemorrhaging woman because she was unseen and invisible. They didn't even notice. But she reached through them anyway, and Jesus saw her anyway. And a crowd that gloried and profited from death would keep Jesus from the child, leaving her for dead. But Jesus cleared the way and healed her anyway. And today, our assumptions about what is good and proper, what is right to speak about in church and what is not, what is polite and acceptable, who is allowed in, they can still keep us from the full impact of Jesus' invitation into healing and restoration, into life. Because when we look at these stories together, what do they show us? Firstly, Jesus builds an unlikely group of followers, inviting in and seeing those society would ignore or reject. And secondly, why do we have stories of the two daughters together, the woman and the girl? Jesus' reaction to the woman and the girl gives us a foreshadowing of his own suffering and death, and the hope of resurrection. Two daughters show us how we might enter into that truth. Two daughters show us the truth about God's Son. Jesus names the bleeding woman as his own daughter. He's not afraid of the shame of the woman's public bleeding. He does not recoil, and he himself will experience the shame and the scandal of bleeding on the cross. Like the woman he so tenderly addresses as daughter, all that suffer like him in the world, all that suffer from what the world sees as shameful, will be seen and named and restored as his child. And like the other daughter, the child who died too soon, pessimistic grandstanding cannot stop Jesus reaching her or us. A father's love brings Jesus right into her home to rescue her. Just like Jesus follows his Father and ours to where we are. There is life to come for the child, for Jesus after the cross, and for us all. These nested stories of a nameless girl and a nameless woman speak hope to every person that feels invisible or shamed or left behind or excluded or kept out or isolated or forgotten. You are a beloved part of the picture in the eyes of God. So bringing that today, with Pallant Brown, the triathlete, let's thank those in the world that would crop the story of the gospel to make it more acceptable in polite society, and we can thank them for their care. But let us decide we're not afraid of bleeding. We're not afraid to bleed, and we're not afraid to be seen to bleed, and we're not afraid to see those that bleed. Because to follow Christ is to cut through everything that would keep us away from God the Father, to cut through the rules that society makes that allow us to reject others and keep them away. It lets us cut through all of those things that create that very human cringe. Because we need to cut through the crowd that mindlessly obstructs people from reaching Christ. We need to silence and send away those whose pride and social and financial gain would leave a child for dead. to shy away from the story, the whole story, that reflects the whole of humanity and the whole of the diversity of those made in the image of God and the whole of human experience, that points to Jesus himself, is to be deprived of that invitation to follow Jesus to the cross, into death, and the promise of resurrection. So forgive me, I pray, my boldness today. And no, I don't wish you discomfort. But for the sake of teaching the word as God gifted it to us, I hope that I have shamelessly followed the example of Christ. Amen.